I'm here at the UFO crash site, which hasn't been open to the public for 71 years. In 1947, a man by the name of Mac Brazel says that this is where he saw a UFO crash, and along this 2-mile stretch is where they say they found a ton of unearthly debris.
In the summer of 1947, beneath the vast and unforgiving sky of the New Mexico high desert, something came down from above and changed the story of Roswell forever. The official explanation would shift with the years. First, the Army Air Force announced that a flying disc had been recovered. Then, the story became a weather balloon. Decades later, it became something more specific. Debris from a classified Project Mogul balloon system designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. Each explanation arrived with the confidence of certainty, yet each seemed to leave behind another question. But there was one man who never publicly joined the debate. For 42 years, Chester Alroy Mabin remained silent. He had been a field recovery specialist with the 5009th Bomb Group, and in 1989, as pancreatic cancer was slowly taking his life, he finally agreed to sit in front of a camera. He knew he was dying. He knew there would be no second opportunity. And according to the account that emerged from those recordings, he had reached the point where fear no longer mattered. "I have nothing left to lose," he said. Then he began describing what he claimed to have witnessed in the New Mexico desert in 1947. The first words attributed to Mabin in the recording are not a description of wreckage, a military operation, or a strange object in the sky. They are a conclusion. Before the interviewer has even begun asking questions, Mabin reportedly looks toward the camera and says, "They weren't human." He does not soften the statement. He does not qualify it. He does not suggest that he might have been mistaken after 4 decades. Instead, he immediately rules out the explanations that would make the event easier to understand. They were not injured airmen. They were not disoriented pilots. They were not Soviet personnel operating some experimental aircraft. They were not human beings trapped inside an unknown machine. That statement becomes the foundation of everything that follows. And the deeper the interview goes, the more disturbing the story becomes, because Mabin does not focus on dramatic details. He remembers logistics, procedures, distances, vehicles, orders, the behavior of men who arrived at the site, the strange absence of paperwork, the things that should have been documented, but apparently were not. Taken individually, each detail could be dismissed. Together, they form the outline of something far more difficult to explain. According to Mabin's account, he was not sent to the primary debris field associated with the Roswell incident. Instead, he claimed that his recovery team was directed toward a second location several miles away, approximately 3 miles southeast of the main site. In the official record, he said, that location did not exist. There was no acknowledged secondary crash site, no corresponding recovery report, and no public documentation describing a second location where a craft had come down. Yet Mabin remembered the terrain with unusual precision. The ground, he said, was not cratered. It was depressed, as though something had descended, and settled into the earth rather than struck it at tremendous speed. Brush had been pushed outward from the center in a wide radial pattern, flattening an area he estimated at roughly 60 feet across. There was no towering column of smoke, no smell of aviation fuel, no evidence of the intense fire normally associated with a catastrophic aircraft crash. There was simply a strange depression in the desert, surrounded by flattened vegetation, and an object that, according to Mabin, should not have been there. He repeatedly called it a craft. That distinction mattered to him. He could have called it debris. He could have called it an object or wreckage, but he deliberately chose the word craft. From his description, it was roughly 30 to 40 feet in diameter and broadly disc-shaped. The eastern portion remained largely intact, while the western side appeared partially collapsed. Yet the most unusual feature was not its shape. It was the surface. Mabin struggled to describe what he saw because, according to his testimony, it did not resemble any conventional aircraft material he had encountered. There were no obvious seams, no rivets, no conventional panels, no visible evidence of the separate components that normally make up a large manufactured structure. He eventually settled on a word that sounded almost unnatural: integrated. The surface seemed less like something assembled and more like something that had somehow become one continuous form. To Mabin, it appeared as though the material had grown into the shape rather than been constructed piece by piece. That impression became even more difficult to reconcile with the technology of 1947. Aircraft of the era were complicated machines, built from thousands of components and held together by fasteners, joints, panels, wiring, engines, and mechanical systems. Even advanced military aircraft displayed obvious evidence of construction. But Mabin claimed that this object seemed almost completely devoid of such evidence. There was no obvious architecture of assembly, no familiar engineering logic. The surface simply existed as one continuous structure. Whether that memory represented something genuinely extraordinary, a misunderstanding created by the shock of the event, or a story altered by decades of recollection, is impossible to establish from the account alone. But Mabin remembered the impression strongly enough that, even in his final years, it remained one of the first details he returned to. Then came the order that changed the encounter from a strange recovery operation into something Mabin would carry for the rest of his life. A senior officer, whom he referred to only as the Colonel, directed him toward the eastern side of the craft. There, according to Mabin, a section of the structure had been opened. He emphasized that it did not look like an explosive rupture. It was not torn apart in the conventional sense. Something had created an opening, and Mabin was ordered to enter. He remembered approaching the craft and then stepping through that damaged section of the hull. Inside, everything became unfamiliar. The recording reportedly contains a long silence at this point, nearly 40 seconds, during which the interviewer, retired investigative journalist Paul Seferian, does not interrupt him. Mabin eventually breaks the silence with a sentence that transforms the entire story. "There were 3 of them," he says. 2 were gone. 1 was not gone. The distinction was important to him. He did not say 2 were dead. He did not describe bodies. He said they were gone. And when Seferian asked what he meant, Mabin reportedly answered that gone meant gone, the way you go when something ends. Then he began describing the 3rd occupant. The first word he used was small, but he immediately made clear that he did not mean childlike. He meant structurally small, as though the being had been built according to a completely different physical proportion. He estimated its height at somewhere between 3.5 and 4 feet. Its head appeared large in relation to its body, but not grotesquely so. Instead, the proportions seemed subtly wrong in a way that the human eye noticed immediately. It was not the exaggerated creature of a science fiction movie. It was something more unsettling precisely because Mabin described it as almost believable, yet fundamentally unlike a human being. The skin was another detail that Mabin seemed determined to get right. He did not describe it simply as gray. In fact, he specifically rejected that word. He said it was not gray, as though he knew exactly what image that word would create and wanted to prevent the listener from imagining something based on popular culture. Instead, he compared the color to something that had never been exposed to sunlight, a pale biological tone with an undertone he could not identify. The being had large eyes, a small mouth, no visible ears, and no hair. Its hands were especially memorable. Mabin described 4 fingers, long and tapered, without the rounded or bulbous fingertips familiar on human hands. They appeared almost purpose-built, as though designed for a function he could not understand. But the most important detail was not physical at all. The being was alive. Mabin paused when he reached that point. Then he corrected himself. Not moving, he said, but alive. He claimed that there was something about its presence that made its condition unmistakable. It was not the stillness of death. It was the stillness of something conscious. Mabin had seen death before, and he said he knew what death looked like. This was different. There was an awareness behind the silence, an interior presence that made the being seem less like an inert body and more like a living mind trapped inside a damaged environment. That was the moment, according to his account, when the recovery operation stopped feeling like the investigation of an aircraft accident and became something else entirely. Yet the strangest part of Mabin's story may not have been what he saw inside the craft. It was what happened outside. He claimed that within approximately 10 minutes of his unit reaching the secondary site, 2 vehicles appeared from the north. They were not standard military vehicles, he said. They were black, unmarked, and occupied by men dressed in civilian clothing. But their behavior immediately suggested military training. They moved with discipline. They communicated efficiently. They appeared to know exactly what they were looking for. And, rather than simply securing the crash site, they did something Mabin found far more disturbing. They established a perimeter around the recovery team itself. The men who had been sent to investigate the wreckage were suddenly the ones being controlled. Why contain the witnesses? That question appears to sit at the center of everything Mabin later described. He claimed that he and his colleagues were held inside that perimeter for approximately 6 hours. They were given water, but no food. They were not permitted to speak privately with one another. Instead, each man was interviewed separately by a quiet official whom Mabin remembered decades later. The man asked the same basic questions repeatedly. What had they seen? In what order had they seen it? Had they touched anything? Had they entered the craft? Had they removed anything? But there was one detail that Mabin found especially strange. The interviewer did not appear to write anything down. No notebook, no formal statement, no carbon copy, no obvious report. He simply listened, asked occasional follow-up questions, and remembered the answers. For Mabin, that absence of documentation became one of the most troubling parts of the entire event. Military organizations were built around paperwork. Equipment failures generated reports. Accidents generated reports. Medical emergencies generated reports. Even routine movements of personnel and equipment produced layers of administrative documentation. Yet, according to Mabin's account, this extraordinary event seemed to leave almost no visible bureaucratic trail. He later claimed that a review of records from the period showed an unusual gap in the administrative history surrounding the incident. Whether that gap truly exists, whether it reflects missing records, archival limitations, or something more deliberate, remains uncertain. But to Mabin, the absence itself became evidence. The event had been handled as though documentation was not merely unnecessary, but dangerous. After approximately 6 hours, the recovery team was transported to Roswell Army Airfield. Mabin said the men were separated into individual rooms. They were not treated like prisoners. In fact, the rooms were reportedly comfortable, equipped with magazines, coffee, and windows overlooking the airfield. That normality may have been more unsettling than confinement. Mabin could look outside, but he could not leave. And from that window, he claimed to have witnessed another unusual operation the following morning. Cargo containers were being loaded onto a C-54 aircraft. The containers themselves appeared ordinary, wooden, military standard boxes, but the way they were handled was anything but ordinary. The men loading the containers wore heavy gloves that Mabin did not recognize as standard issue. More importantly, they moved the boxes with unusual caution. Mabin described them as being careful about one particular orientation, as though the contents had to remain positioned in a specific direction. He had seen sensitive military equipment loaded before. He knew how valuable instruments were handled. He knew how fragile equipment was transported. This felt different. The caution seemed almost biological. He could not explain why he had that impression, but it stayed with him. Eventually, the aircraft disappeared, and Mabin never learned where it went. If the containers contained nothing extraordinary, the mystery would be easy to dismiss. But if they contained material recovered from the strange object in the desert, then the aircraft represented the next missing piece in a chain of events that had already vanished from the official record. The following day, Mabin was released. He was given verbal instructions that were described as simple and complete. He was not to discuss what he had seen. He was not to write about it. He was not to contact the other members of his recovery team about what had happened. A cover explanation had already been prepared, he was told, and his cooperation was expected. He was not asked whether he understood. There was no negotiation. No threat was necessary. The expectation itself was enough, and Mabin obeyed. For the next 42 years he carried the memory privately, never publicly describing the craft, the being, the strange vehicles, the containers, or the unexplained silence that surrounded the entire operation. Then, in 1989, everything changed. Mabin was dying of pancreatic cancer. The fear that had kept him silent for 4 decades had lost its power. He agreed to sit in front of Paul Sifarian's camera and speak. The interview reportedly lasted 8 hours over 2 days in April 1989 at a home in Tucson, Arizona. The recordings were made on standard VHS cassettes. Sifarian kept copies in a storage unit in Albuquerque and reportedly gave another set to a woman identified only by the initials MV. Her identity was never clearly recorded. That detail would become important later because the full recordings would eventually disappear from public view. Mabin died in July 1989, only 3 months after the interview. Sifarian lived longer, but not by much in historical terms. He died of a heart attack in 1994. The tapes passed through several hands, and their final whereabouts became increasingly difficult to establish. Portions of Sifarian's correspondence reportedly survived, and were eventually associated with special collections at the University of Arizona. The correspondence referenced the recordings and suggested that Sifarian regarded their contents as extraordinarily important. But the complete 8 hours of testimony never became part of a widely accessible public archive. Instead, fragments and partial transcripts circulated among researchers, leaving behind an unsettling question that remains at the center of the story. If Mabin truly recorded what he claimed to remember, where are the original tapes now? The surviving fragments of the interview only deepen the mystery. In a 1991 letter to a colleague, Sifarian reportedly referred to the tapes as the most consequential thing I have ever been near. Whatever response he received, if there was one, is not preserved in the archive. What remains are partial transcripts prepared by Sifarian himself, covering roughly 40% of the original 8-hour interview. Somehow, those fragments began circulating among a small community of serious Roswell researchers. Their journey into that underground world of researchers, archivists, and investigators is itself filled with gaps, missing names, uncertain dates, and unanswered questions. But the transcripts survived, and once you read them closely, something about Mabin's testimony begins to stand out. It is not simply what he claims to have seen. It is the way he remembers it. His recollections are strangely specific in places where a storyteller might normally focus on the dramatic. He repeatedly returns to details that seem almost meaningless. The quality of the morning light, the texture of the desert air, a smell inside the craft that he could never identify. It wasn't unpleasant, he said, but it lingered. Something almost electrical, yet somehow organic. He remembers the sound of his own breathing inside the craft, and insists that it sounded different from normal. He cannot explain why. He does not invent an explanation. He simply remembers it. And that may be the most unusual quality of the testimony. Mabin does not appear to be trying to make every detail fit a larger theory. He remembers things because they happened, even when they do not help him explain what happened. The absence of sound seems to bother him as much as the strange sounds themselves. The light seems to matter. The smell matters. The sensation of standing inside an unfamiliar structure matters. These are the kinds of peripheral details that can survive in genuine memories, details that have no obvious purpose except that they were noticed and never forgotten. That does not prove the story is true. Memory is complicated, especially across 4 decades, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But there is an argument to be made that fabricated stories tend to behave differently. They become too clean, too cinematic, too perfectly arranged. Every detail seems designed to reinforce the conclusion. Mabin's account, at least in the surviving transcripts, does not always behave that way. It wanders. It hesitates. He admits when he does not know something. He struggles for words. He returns to seemingly insignificant observations. And occasionally, his recollection appears less like a story being told and more like a memory being excavated from somewhere deep inside him. That distinction cannot authenticate the event, but it does make the testimony more difficult to dismiss simply because it sounds strange. And then there is the official story. Roswell's explanation did not remain fixed. On July 8, 1947, the Army Air Force issued a press release announcing that personnel had recovered a flying disc from a ranch near Roswell. The statement generated immediate attention, and almost immediately the explanation changed. The object was described instead as a weather balloon. Decades later, the U.S. Air Force presented a more detailed explanation, identifying the debris as material associated with Project Mogul, a classified balloon program designed to monitor Soviet nuclear testing. Each explanation was delivered with the authority of an institution attempting to close the case. Yet for people who continued investigating Roswell, every revision created another question. If the first explanation was correct, why was it changed? If the second was correct, why did the story need another explanation decades later? And if the final explanation accounted for the debris, what accounted for the stories of witnesses who claimed to have encountered something else? That is where the alleged secondary debris field becomes important. Mabin's account describes a location roughly 3 miles southeast of the primary site, a place that, according to the story, never appeared in the official record. On its own, that claim could be dismissed as faulty memory. But the surviving material allegedly contains references to other individuals who independently described something similar. One was a retired nurse named Dorothy Calloway, who reportedly recalled overhearing a conversation between officers at the Roswell Base Hospital in which a southern field site was discussed in connection with material requiring special handling. Another was a former communications technician named Ray Escoto, whose handwritten statement, reportedly discovered after his death in 1997, referred to relaying a signal on the night of July 4th to a location whose coordinates placed it approximately 3 miles southeast of the primary debris area. The significance of those accounts, if they are authentic, is not that any one of them proves anything. It is the repetition that draws attention. Different people, different circumstances, different decades. Yet the same general location appears to emerge from the fragments. Not merely a vague reference to somewhere outside Roswell, but a specific direction and distance, 3 miles southeast. The pattern is intriguing precisely because none of the individual pieces is conclusive. A coincidence can happen once. A faulty memory can happen once. A misunderstood conversation can happen once. But when several stories appear to converge on the same geographical detail, the question changes. Instead of asking whether one witness is telling the truth, you begin asking whether there was something happening in that area that never entered the official narrative. Then there is the silence that followed Mabin's interview. According to Seafarian's correspondence, he attempted to interest several major television news organizations in the recordings. The responses were reportedly disappointing. 2 were formal rejections. A third came from a senior producer whose name appears in Seafarian's notes. Seafarian described the conversation as the moment he realized the story would not be going anywhere. He never publicly explained exactly what was said. Perhaps nothing extraordinary happened. Perhaps the producer simply considered the material unreliable. Perhaps the tapes were too difficult to verify. Or perhaps, as Seafarian apparently believed, someone had decided that the story should never receive a major platform. We cannot know, but Seafarian continued looking for one. He spent the remaining years of his life trying to place the story. He found no major network willing to broadcast it, no documentary producer willing to take responsibility for it, no obvious public platform. Eventually, he described the situation as encountering a wall that had no door in it. It is a striking phrase because it captures the central frustration surrounding the entire case. There was supposedly evidence, but no complete archive. There were witnesses, but no official acknowledgement. There were transcripts, but not the original recordings. There were references to locations, but no publicly accepted documentation confirming them. Every path seemed to lead toward another locked door. Yet among all the fragments, one section of Mabin's testimony stands apart. It concerns what happened inside the craft during the few minutes he spent near the surviving being. By this point in the interview, he had already described the interior. He said there were no obvious light fixtures, no lamps, no visible source illuminating the room. Instead, the entire interior seemed evenly lit, almost as though the walls themselves were producing a faint glow. He described the strange smell again. He described the silence. He described the sensation of hearing his own breathing differently. And then Seafarian asked the question that seems almost inevitable after everything Mabin had already revealed.